Welcome back to 15-Minute Discourse. Today, we're going to be talking about something that you probably encounter every day without even realizing it. Microplastics.
They really are everywhere. Pretty eye-opening for me on just how widespread this problem actually is.
Yeah. Plastic pollution in the ocean is something that we hear about all the time, but this feels like a whole other level of insidious.
Yeah, well, it's the size that makes them so tricky. We're talking fragments less than 5 millimeters wide. So picture like a grain of rice, but cut into even tinier pieces. And that's about the size we're dealing with.
So these tiny bits of plastic are everywhere, but why should we care? What's the big deal?
Well, because they're so small, they can basically infiltrate every single corner of our ecosystem. And, we all know plastic takes hundreds, if not thousands of years to break down.
Yeah.
So these microplastics essentially become a permanent fixture, impacting everything from the soil to the air we breathe.
Okay, so that's pretty unsettling. Something like trillions of microplastic pieces in the ocean alone. Hundreds of thousands of metric tons. Like that's a number so big it's hard to even fathom.
And what's even more alarming is that these microplastics aren't just, floating around out there in the ocean. They're in our food, our water, even our bodies.
Oh, wow. So you mentioned we encounter these things daily. Where are these tiny troublemakers hiding? I know plastic bottles break down over time, but are there other sources that maybe I'm not even aware of?
Yeah, there are two main types of microplastics. There are primary microplastics and secondary microplastics. So primary microplastics are things like microbeads, which are those tiny little plastic spheres that are found in some face washes, or things like nurdles.
Nurdles, what are those?
So nurdles are basically these tiny plastic pellets, and they're kind of like the raw material for almost everything plastic, and they can spill during transport or manufacturing. And once they're in the environment, they're incredibly difficult to clean up.
So it's like the seeds of the plastic pollution problem, essentially.
That's a really great way to put it. And then you have the secondary microplastics, which are formed when larger plastic items break down over time. So, think of your plastic bag, your water bottle, fishing nets even. And they slowly disintegrate into these smaller and smaller pieces.
Okay, so primary microplastics are intentionally tiny, and then the secondary ones are the results of these bigger plastics breaking down.
Exactly. And while both are problematic, research actually indicates that tire wear and tear might be an even bigger contributor than all of those primary microplastics combined.
Wait, really? So tires are a major source of microplastics?
One study estimated that tire wear contributes something like 500,000 tons of microplastics every year. And to put that into perspective, that's like the equivalent of 100 Eiffel Towers worth of microplastics being released into the environment each year.
So are you telling me that driving my car is contributing to microplastic pollution?
Essentially, yeah. Tiny bits of tire rubber get worn away every time your tire rotates. So our roads basically become a major source of these microplastics.
I had absolutely no idea it was that significant. The article also mentioned something about face masks being a surprising source of microplastics too.
Yeah, it's true. Those disposable face masks that we've all become so accustomed to, well, they're made from polymers that can shed thousands of microfibers daily. Kind of highlights how new sources of these microplastics are constantly emerging.
So it's not just our pre-pandemic habits that we need to be mindful of, but also the new materials we've introduced into our lives. This microplastic problem really is a moving target.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue that demands ongoing research and awareness and, of course, action. And the article also highlighted how these microplastics aren't just a local problem. They're found everywhere, from the Great Lakes to the Antarctic sea ice. They've even been found in the deepest parts of the ocean.
It's like they're on this global expedition.
It's a journey that no one wants to be a part of. Wind carries these microplastics far and wide, even to remote mountain areas. And it's not just those far-off places either. Our food supply is also being affected. So microplastics have been found in things like table salt and seafood.
So not only are these microplastics impacting the environment, but we're also potentially ingesting them.
Exactly. And that's where things start to get really concerning. Because the article actually brought up the discovery of microplastics in human breast milk. And while the long-term health effects are still being studied, it does raise some serious concerns about the impact on humans, especially infants.
Wow, that's alarming. So is there any concrete evidence yet of how these microplastics might be affecting our health?
Well, research is ongoing. Some studies have linked microplastic exposure to things like respiratory issues and inflammation in humans. But what's really concerning is what we're seeing in wildlife. There's this newly identified disease called plasticosis that's affecting seabirds.
Plasticosis, can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So plasticosis is characterized by scarring and inflammation of the digestive tract, particularly in seabirds. So imagine having these tiny shards of plastic constantly irritating your stomach. That's essentially what these birds are experiencing, and it affects their digestion, their growth, and ultimately their survival.
That's heartbreaking, and really is a stark reminder that these microplastics are having real-world consequences. It seems like they're everywhere and affecting everything.
Unfortunately, that's the reality we're facing.
So are all organisms being impacted the same way by microplastics?
That's where things get even more complicated because research suggests that different organisms respond to these microplastics in unique ways. For example, some studies on oysters have shown that these microplastics can actually affect their reproductive health and actually harm their larvae and embryos. So it really raises concerns about the long-term impacts on biodiversity and the health of entire ecosystems.
That's incredibly worrying. I mean, we've talked a lot about the negative impacts here, but what about solutions? I mean, is there any hope in this seemingly really dire situation?
I think there is hope, and I think that's actually where this deep dive gets really interesting.
So we just talked about the reality of microplastics in our food supply. It's enough to make you want to swear off seafood altogether.
It really gets you thinking about these everyday items in a whole new light.
Right. Like, who knew that my morning cup of tea could be contributing to this problem?
That's one of those things that caught me off guard, too. I mean, we've talked about, larger plastics breaking down and things like microbeads, but a lot of tea bags, especially those with kind of that silky texture, they actually contain plastic to help them keep their shape.
So every time I steep a tea bag, I could be releasing tiny plastic fibers into my drink.
That's the unfortunate reality. And it's not just tea bags either. Think about glitter. It's basically microplastic in its most festive form.
Oh man, glitter. I never would have thought of it as like a major source of pollution, though.
Well, it's made from these thin sheets of peat plastic that are cut into those tiny sparkly shapes that we all know and love. And, it's basically impossible to clean up completely. So it ends up in the environment just like other forms of microplastic.
So every time I break out the glitter for a craft project, I'm potentially contributing to this microplastic problem. It makes you think twice about the seemingly harmless activities.
It's all about awareness, right? Once you start seeing these microplastics for what they are, they kind of pop up everywhere.
So even seemingly innovative technologies can have these hidden downsides.
Mm.
What other unexpected sources did this deep dive uncover?
Here's one that really blew my mind. Construction and renovation. We don't often think about buildings as a source of plastic pollution, but they actually contribute a significant amount.
Construction. How so?
Well, think about all the plastic materials that are used in a typical building. You've got your PVC pipes, insulation, flooring, siding. As these materials age and break down, they release microplastics. And even during the construction process itself, like when they're cutting and sanding these materials, it creates this microplastic dust that can end up in the environment.
So from the moment construction begins to the eventual demolition of a building, we're generating microplastics.
Exactly. And the article even mentions something as seemingly innocuous as composite decking. Cutting that material creates a surprising amount of microplastic dust.
It really does feel like there's no escape from these microplastics. They're in our food, our clothes, our homes. It's overwhelming. Speaking of the environment, bioaccumulation, which is how these microplastics build up in organisms over time.
Yeah, bioaccumulation is a major concern. Think about those marine organisms like zooplankton and fish. They mistake these tiny bits of plastic for food and they ingest them.
And because plastic doesn't break down easily, those microplastics just accumulate inside the animals.
Right, that's exactly what happens. And it's not just a matter of them taking up space in the digestive system. It can actually lead to starvation because the animals feel full from eating plastic, even though they're not getting any real nutrients. And then there's the issue of the toxins that microplastics absorb.
Right. We talked earlier about how they act like little sponges, soaking up pollutants from their surroundings.
And as those contaminated microplastics are ingested and move up the food chain, the concentration of toxins increases. So even if we're not directly eating microplastics, we could be consuming them indirectly through the seafood that we eat.
That's a terrifying thought. This whole conversation is really making me reconsider my dietary choices. But it's not just the ocean that's being affected, right? We've talked about how microplastics are in the soil, but what does that mean for the food that we grow?
That's a really crucial question. And while the research on the impact of microplastics on those terrestrial ecosystems is still kind of in its early stages, the initial findings are pretty worrisome.
What are some of the concerns?
Well, studies have shown that microplastics in the soil can actually reduce its viability, and that can affect plant growth and disrupt nutrient cycles. And remember, we rely on healthy soil to grow the food that we eat.
It feels like this domino effect, you know. Contaminated soil leads to contaminated food, which ultimately could impact human health.
That's the concern. And it's not just the plants that are being affected. The article highlighted research showing that earthworms are ingesting these microplastics, and that could disrupt their ability to break down organic matter and maintain soil health.
So even the creatures that we rely on to keep our soil healthy are being impacted. It's like these microplastics are disrupting the delicate balance of our entire ecosystem.
That's a very accurate way to put it. And, it's not just theoretical harm that we're talking about either. The article mentioned a new disease called plasticosis that has been found in seabirds.
Plasticosis, I've never heard of that. What is it?
So, plasticosis is a disease that's specifically caused by the ingestion of plastic. Seabirds that have ingested these small pieces of plastic have been found to have these scarred and disfigured digestive tracts due to the persistent inflammation. It affects their digestion, their growth, and ultimately their survival.
That's heartbreaking. And it really drives home the point that these seemingly insignificant pieces of plastic are causing real and devastating consequences for wildlife.
It's a wake-up call for all of us. But the good news is that there are efforts being made to address this problem.
Are there any, glimmers of hope out there?
There absolutely are. It's encouraging to see that awareness of this issue is growing, and that's led to some significant political and social responses that are aimed at curbing microplastic pollution.
That's reassuring to hear. Can you give us some specific examples of the steps that are being taken?
For sure. The Wikipedia article we've been looking at highlights some promising developments. For instance, back in 2014, Illinois became the first U.S. state to ban microplastics in cosmetics, which was a pretty landmark move.
So no more microbeads and face washes and scrubs in Illinois.
That's right. And that action at the state level actually helped pave the way for federal action. In 2015, the U.S. passed the Microbead-Free Waters Act, which banned microbeads in those rinse-off cosmetic products nationwide.
That's a huge win. What about other countries? Are we seeing similar actions being taken internationally?
Yes, definitely. Japan, for example, passed a law in 2018 that focuses on reducing microplastic production, particularly from personal care products. Their approach is interesting because it goes beyond just banning specific products like microbeads. They're aiming to reduce microplastic use across the board.
That sounds like a much more comprehensive approach. How exactly are they going about doing that?
Well, they're promoting the use of alternative materials, encouraging the development and adoption of biodegradable or compostable options, and even incentivizing companies to reduce their plastic footprint throughout their whole production process.
So it's like a multi-pronged strategy that involves regulation, innovation, and collaboration with industry.
Exactly. And their legislation also emphasizes the importance of public education and awareness campaigns that focus on things like recycling and responsible plastic waste management.
It sounds like they're really taking a holistic approach to tackling this.
Mhm.
What about the European Union? Are they doing anything about microplastics?
The EU has also been really proactive on this front. They've implemented a ban on intentionally added microplastics in a whole range of products, including cosmetics, detergents, and fertilizers.
Wow, that's a pretty big step. When does that ban go into full effect?
It's being phased in gradually, but full implementation is expected in 2025. It's one of the most comprehensive bans on microplastics anywhere in the world.
That's great to hear. It's inspiring to see these kinds of actions being taken at these national and international levels. But what about regions of the world that maybe don't have the resources or infrastructure to implement these kinds of sweeping bans? Are there any efforts being made to support them?
That's a really important point, and thankfully, there are initiatives in place to address that challenge. One example is the Clean Oceans Initiative.
I've heard of that. Can you remind me what the Clean Oceans Initiative is all about?
Sure. So it was launched back in 2018, and it's a collaborative effort between European and international financial institutions. And the goal is to provide funding and support for projects that aim to reduce pollution in waterways, with a particular emphasis on plastic waste and microplastics.
So it's not just about regulations and bans. It's also about providing financial and technical assistance to help regions around the world actually tackle this problem.
Exactly. And what's particularly interesting about the Clean Oceans Initiative is that they focus on those riverine and coastal areas, recognizing that a lot of the plastic pollution that ends up in the ocean originates from those land-based sources.
So it's a more proactive approach, trying to stop the problem at its source rather than just cleaning up the mess after it's already reached the ocean.
Exactly. It's about preventing that plastic waste from entering the waterways in the first place. And it highlights the importance of international cooperation when it comes to addressing this global challenge.
Okay, so we're seeing governments enacting bans, international organizations providing funding and support, and there's a growing awareness of this issue among the general public. That's all very positive, but I have to ask, is it enough? Can we realistically solve this microplastic problem, or are we kind of fighting a losing battle here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The honest answer is it's still too early to say for sure. The microplastic problem is massive, and it's complex, and there's no easy fix.
But are there reasons to be hopeful?
Definitely. I think the fact that we're having this conversation, that there's so much research and innovation happening, and that governments and organizations are taking concrete steps to address the problem, all of that points to a growing momentum in the right direction.
What are some of the most promising solutions that are being explored right now?
Well, one area that's showing a lot of potential is the development of these advanced filtration systems that are designed to capture microplastics from wastewater. Imagine if we could prevent those tiny particles from entering the environment in the first place. That would be a game changer.
So we're talking about addressing the problem at the wastewater treatment level.
Exactly. And there are also some really exciting developments happening in the field of material science. Researchers are working on creating new types of plastics that are biodegradable or compostable, meaning they can break down naturally in the environment without living behind those harmful microplastics.
So it's a two-pronged approach then. Cleaning up the microplastics that are already out there and preventing new ones from being created in the first place.
Precisely. And of course, none of this can happen without continued public awareness and engagement. The more people understand the problem, the more likely they are to demand action from their leaders, to support sustainable businesses, and to make more informed choices in their own lives.
It really does feel like a collective effort is needed to solve this problem.
Absolutely. It's going to take all of us, individuals, communities, governments, and businesses working together to create a world where microplastic pollution is a thing of the past.
Well, that's our deep dive on microplastics. A tiny threat with enormous consequences. It's a complex issue, but one that we can't afford to ignore.
And remember, even small actions can make a difference. Every time you choose a reusable bag over a plastic one, buy a product without microbeads, or participate in a local cleanup effort, you're contributing to the solution.
We hope you found this exploration insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring. If you'd like to learn more about microplastics and what you can do to help, be sure to check out the links in the show notes.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. The more people we can educate about this issue, the closer we'll get to finding solutions.
Thanks for joining us on 15-Minute Discourse. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged in making the world a healthier place one step at a time.